let me get this. So yeah, this is an initiative that's being put together by members of the AIMS, which is the Analysis of Integration Modeling Earth Systems, Project of Future Earth, and the Land Data Assimilation Working Group, and also the International Land Model Forum Parameter Estimation Working Group. So you see here a range of faces and names from the planning committee. And in a minute, I'll get to the motivation for the workshop and why now, but I just wanted to introduce everyone here. I will introduce myself. I'm Natasha McBean at Western University in Canada. I've worked on parameter estimation for carbon cycle and vegetation for a while now. Okay. Before we also get started, I wanted to just respectfully remind everybody to be mindful when we're having discussions, give time for everyone to talk, listen, offer constructive feedback, and just generally to be respectful of others as we have especially a good amount of time for breakout sessions today in different groups, and then reporting back to the whole plenary session. Okay, so first up, a little bit of motivation for why we've started this calibrated land model into comparison. I think maybe that doesn't need too much explanation, but we'll go through that anyway. Basically, we know that there's a large spread across land surface models. I've shown a picture here for carbon cycle for future projections out over the next century. So that's just one example for the carbon cycle, but I think if we plot many variables from land surface models, we see a huge spread both in the current estimates and also in future projections. And I showed this one from Vivek Arora's paper because it nicely has the CMIP 5 and then the CMIP 6, and we see that that spread isn't really decreasing over time. And so this is obviously not a new idea, as we've had, I think, almost 5 years now of annual workshops within the land data assimilation community. We've talked about trying to have some kind of calibrated land model into comparison like this. There have been a couple in the past, but they were more looking at site scale and not always with these global land surface models. And there are existing efforts such as the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, Forecasting Challenge. But again, we're sort of thinking more about these broader scales over the whole Earth, the whole land surface at least, and using these more global scale land surface models that typically form the land part of Earth system models, or similar models like that. So our goals then are, to try and see to what extent can calibrating your model parameters reduce this spread across models. We may hope so, but it may not be the case. How is the calibration performance varying across models? How much do we get a reduction in model data misfit as we optimize our parameters? And then how much do these answers vary depending on whether you're looking at a site scale optimization, which variables we're looking at, etc. So that's the very quick, broad motivation, because I think probably I don't need to explain that or outline that too much to this community. And I think with all of you being interested, that's what you're here for. Oh, I can't get this. Yeah. Okay, so briefly, I'll give a quick overview of the whole workshop series, and then we'll go into our specific plan from the planning committee, and why we've put that plan together and the sort of goals of this series of workshops. So we have this first session. We had one session last night for my time zone, and now this morning for my time zone. We're trying to have we are having two sessions for each, or 2 times for each of these sessions, so that we can try and cover as much of the world as possible, to get as many voices as possible and feedback from you all on this idea of a CalMIP. Our second session is in about 2 weeks on March 19th, and then the final session is 1st of April. What to expect from each session. So our overall goal as a planning committee is to plan out the first stage of the calibrated model into comparison. We wanted initially to, have as much buy-in as possible from the community, as much feedback as possible. We got, I think, I can't remember now, but it was over 70 people registering. And thank you all for filling out the registration survey. So with that many people and all that feedback that we'd already gathered, we decided to put some sort of plan together first, outlining things that we've sort of, as you'll see, decided to some degree, but still want feedback on, and things that we all still need to discuss. We thought it'd be better to have a bit of a plan to work off of, because otherwise it could take too long with especially with that many people to come up with a plan for this first stage. So the goal for today is for us to share that vision and plan with you, sorry, then to have breakout discussions about that plan. So any thoughts you have really, and then to report back on that to get your initial feedback and have a bit of a discussion about what comes next in the second session. So in the second session, the second and third session, what exactly we do will be a bit flexible depending on how previous sessions go. So we're expecting that, we won't finish the discussions in this first session, and we'll need some more time in the second session to do that. Last night there was a little bit of some people raised that we might want to at that point have more of a discussion about the overall vision, sort of long-term goals for CalMIP, and that might help us decide more what goes in this first stage. So that's something we'll ask you about towards the end today. But in general, we'll continue the discussion in the second session, think about the plan for the protocol, potentially a protocol paper, and then start looking ahead more to the kind of analyses we might do with this first stage experiments. And yeah, at some point in the second and third session, thinking about just having some kind of discussion of our long-term goals as a community for this CalMIP. But where that comes exactly, we're flexible on changing that. So yeah, we absolutely need by the end of this first three workshops, first three sessions, a consensus on a protocol for this first stage of experiments. That's absolutely what we need. And also which modeling groups based on that will contribute, so we know who we're going to be talking to. The sort of secondary goals, if you like, are to have, as I mentioned, just an initial discussion on the analyses we'll do after that. I think we should start having that discussion, but we can finalize that once the experiments are done, and then also have some initial discussion on long-term vision for CalMIP. Timeline, roughly. So we have these community sessions now. Over the next 4 or 5 months or so, we're going to be preparing in my group, and Sam Hopkins, who is on the call today, will be helping me with that, preparing input files, observation files, the protocol, etc., for all modeling groups. From September onwards, we're going to deliver that to all modeling groups if we decide to go ahead with a protocol paper, a draft of that paper. We also had a lot of interest from people who aren't going to do any parameter calibration experiments, but wanted to keep up to date with what we're doing. So we've suggested that we'll have a webinar at that point to sort of say what the outcome of this meeting was and what we're all doing, who's involved, etc., as well as preliminary discussions on what the future vision for CalMIP would be. That would be an online webinar. Obviously, webinar is online. Then over the next sort of 7 or 8 months or so, the modeling groups would carry out those experiments and give the outputs back to us. And then the following few months would be an initial first analyses of those results. There's some discussion in the International Land Modeling Forum Steering Committee about having a second land surface modeling summit next sort of June, July, August time. And so that would be a good opportunity to present some initial results. But if that doesn't happen, then we would find some other meeting or some other way of presenting those first results. at that point. So that's a rough timeline for you all. Obviously, like everything really today, we're gathering feedback from you, so it's open for suggestions and possible changes. Okay, so our plan, our proposal for the CalMIP protocol. First, some sort of guiding principles or philosophies, I should say, that we have that are guiding what we do here today, what we've suggested here today. I'd say it's not necessarily, it's what we're presenting is not at all everything we'd like to do. Okay, our guiding principles are that we want to leverage what people are already doing and keep it as simple as possible, so that as many people can get involved as possible without needing to do a lot of extra work that, it's voluntary work, right? Before they are able to participate. So the goal then is to keep it as simple as possible, whilst obviously trying to harmonize what we need to so that we can compare things between the different models. And then the goal of this first stage is really to kind of describe, in a sort of traditional MIP style paper, how well the models are doing for those questions that I mentioned at the beginning. How does it reduce the fit in predicted variables like carbon fluxes or soil moisture, something like that? How much does that model data misfit vary across models? We're expecting that because everyone's going to be doing different things. People will be just using the methods that they're using in their in-house systems, that it's going to be a bit hard to really learn or figure out why there are differences across models. We're not necessarily in this first stage having the goal of trying to really dig into the weeds of which methods work well, which approaches work well. Having said that, I'll put a little pin in that because we had some discussion on that last night, and I might have an additional proposal to put to you on that part. But the primary goal is just, as many MIP papers, is just to sort of, I'd say, document, but describe the results of what's happening, not to explain why too much. I hope that's clear. One thing that we are keen to do, we're going to generate a lot of experiments, I expect, in this CalMIP, given the interest, which is great. We are really strongly going to ask that outputs are available in a public repository so that other analyses can be done by the community. And we have had some interest in people that are, really digging into why models are doing what they're doing, and they're interested to know how calibrated models would work as well. Another thing we've sort of decided somewhat, although this was discussed a bit last night, is that to begin with, in this first stage, we'll focus just on site-based optimization. The goal there is to, again, keep it as simple as possible. We did talk about having both site and global scale optimizations, but for now we think it, again, under this guiding principle of keeping it as simple as possible, we'd like to focus just on sites. It keeps it easier for us preparing the input files and etc. Okay, so in this proposed plan, in the following slides, we've color-coded things. It'll hopefully start to make sense in a minute. But in the dark blue is kind of what we've decided, in a sense of we're strongly suggesting that it be that way. Again, open to some feedback. But in red is what is really undecided. It's really what we want people to chat about more today. So to start with, so the proposed plan for the calibration, the optimization of parameters, we've got a set of things that we think should be constant and fixed across all modeling groups that are listed here. Exactly what those things are in red, right? So which forcing data we use, we think it should be set for all groups, but which forcing data we use is open for discussion, and I'll come back to that. That we've said, we'd like to focus on site-based optimization, but which sites, observation period, the temporal sampling frequency, the observation uncertainties, the spin-up protocol. Again, we think that should be fixed across modeling groups. I'll note that observation uncertainties and spin-up protocol, there was some discussion last night about whether that could actually be flexible and decided by each individual group. And then soil characteristics, site vegetation type will be constant. That's not something we really need to talk about. We can get that data. The calibration validation split between, number of or percentage of sites and years that are left for validation. Again, that sort of feeds into the observation period for calibration. So that should be constant across groups, but how exactly how we do that is, again, open for discussion. So what we think should be flexible or defined or decided by each modeling group is the calibration strategy, the method used. One thing we do think we want to impose, I should have said this in the last slide, but is that everyone do some kind of multi-site calibration. But how you do that is, we think, should be decided by each modeling group. So we don't want to get a new set of parameters for each site. We want some kind of multi-site framework. But yeah, how that's done can be decided depending on how your system works. We've had some discussion about whether we should sort of provide guidelines of prior parameter bounds or uncertainties, or whether that should just be, again, flexible, decided by each modeling group. So that has a question mark there, that the ones with question marks could go in either the constants fixed across groups or flexible, decided by groups. And also whether we want to, think about guidelines on number of parameters, or whether we just leave that to each modeling group. The calibration variables, as you'll see in a minute, we're optimizing with site-based flux tower data. There's various different variables that can be used. And we have the idea of having a buy-in model. So you don't have to optimize with, say, carbon fluxes and latent heat flux, etc. You can pick one of them as an option. I see questions arriving. I'm going to let Hannah take a look at those and tell me whether I should stop or answer them at the end. But I'll just finish this slide. So whether you have prescribed or prognostic LAI, again, decided by your group. And then obviously all the methods that everyone's using here, anything that's separated out by each group, different for each group, needs to be really carefully documented. So we need to come up with, a good list of things together as a group that we need to have as information, so that we can maybe at least discuss why we see differences between different models. I know I don't want to look at my chat because it's sometimes
the planning committee's been jumping in, so Daniel and Jana have responded.
Okay, awesome, great. I will let you do that. Okay, so more specifics on some of this. So again, color scheme, blue is decided and red is, we need to talk about, which we want to standardize the forcing data sets. Climate forcing, I haven't added, vegetation, things like that, but really talking about met forcing here. So we want to standardize, but which forcing data sets we use is open for discussion. There's been a lot of discussion already about using Plummer2 sites, which is a MIP organized by Gab Abramovich. I think, more for the hydrology side than maybe carbon. I could be saying that wrong, but in any case, they've put together a whole load of sites that they have really carefully checked and gap filled and done a lot of QA on. And so they have, I think it's described in their paper, 154 sites or so that they really trust, and we'd be selecting from those. And Gab is very supportive of this initiative. It would be a lot easier for us to prepare files in that way, because it's already been prepared for a lot of models. And I think a lot of models are already, have those files on site, as it were. The files include PFT fractions, and with Plummer2 comes a whole protocol that we could also leverage. The problem with those forcing files and really any other forcing files that I'm aware of is they just have the site period of data collection. They're not bias corrected back using a reanalysis back in time. There is that available from FluxNet, but I don't believe it's included in, say, Plumber. I should just highlight Plumber 2 has been set up for models, right? So it's really helpful in that way. What I have become aware of in the last week or so is that some folks at Environment and Climate Change Canada have bias corrected a bunch of Canadian flux tower forcing data back using, I forget which reanalysis now, but back to 1900. And so as I'll talk about on the next slide, this can be helpful depending on the type of spin up we want to do and which variables we're interested in, maybe particularly for the carbon cycle. There are a bunch of NEON sites that have been prepared for models as part of the Ecological Forecasting Initiative Forecasting Challenge. And Mike Dietz, who was on the call last night, said they can provide more sites than North America. So that's an option. And then just down at the bottom there, if some models are using, I need to change that to predictive, they need an LAI to drive the model, then that is something that we need to decide which data sets we'll use as well. So yeah, coming to spin up just directly after the forcing. Obviously, as I just mentioned, if we choose forcing files that are only for the flux tower observation period, then the typical protocol is obviously for the spin up, you cycle over those files, and then there's the question of how you simulate the last 150 years or so, going up to about 1850. So the protocol, for example, in Plumber 2, is that for the transient run since 1851, you still recycle the site forcing, but you have a transient CO2. So for the carbon variables in particular, you will get some sort of carbon sink from that, but maybe not as much as if you had the sort of climate change that was forcing as well, right? If we use the bias corrected sites from the ECCC, then we can follow more of a sort of typical trendy style protocol where in addition to transient CO2, we can have that climate change over most of that period. And they have said that they will process additional sites for non-Canadian sites. So that's great. We need to decide for spin up as well for this, not spin up, so the transient run, whether we include the land use change history, and if so, how. And there was some discussion last night as to whether, the exact protocol, I should say spin up and transient here, the exact protocol for this transient period should be dependent on the variable you're interested in. It's obviously more important for carbon than maybe for hydrology, for example, or whether it should just be decided by individual groups. But it actually in some ways can't be, because it influences our forcing files that we choose, I think, unless I'm sort of missing something on that. There was some discussion though as to whether we get two sets of forcing files, which we maybe could decide to do. It would be more work and maybe more confusion. So everything in red here to be discussed today, I think would be great. In terms of optimization data sets, again, as we have decided to use in situ flux data for the optimization, it's really anything that is, and we want to standardize across, a number of sites, and the number of sites needs to be decided. But then it's typical variables that are measured at flux tower sites. There was some discussion last night as to whether we can get enough sites with soil moisture to include soil moisture in this list. That's something to discuss today. But otherwise, at some point, we need to make a decision on which sites, which observation period, the frequency that we optimize. That maybe could be decided for each modeling group, and how we define observation uncertainties. Then the plan for outputs. So a lot of this obviously is already in blue. It will be standardized. So we'll have the optimized variables that must be output. And then plus any additional data that we'll talk about in the next slide. We'll have a standard naming convention of CMIP names following CF metadata conventions. We'll output to netcdf files. And then there'll be a standard set of extra metadata or information such as model version, the calibration method, which parameters, how many parameters, etc., that we all need to have documented when we submit the results of these calibrations. So that's mostly in blue, but then additional evaluation data sets. So one thing, I'll start with, so any kind of additional site data that we don't have as optimization variables can be used for evaluation as well. So anything that we could sort of get our hands on at sites. I will say, of course, that at some point this is going to be standardized by someone. And so, I think we need to make some decisions. I appreciate that there's lots of different people. We could see that in the survey wanting lots of different things, but just again, to keep it as simple as possible, it's going to need to be readily available and easy to access in this first stage, unless people want to separately do some work to get additional data sets that can be used for the whole group. One thing I didn't mention when we said we'd fixed on a site scale optimization is that we want to encourage, whilst site scale optimization, but global scale simulations with optimized parameters as outputs. Maybe the planning committee will correct me on this. I think we said that's optional, but strongly encouraged. And in that case, of course, we need to decide on which data sets we'll use to evaluate those global scale outputs from satellite products, machine learning based upscaling products, etc. Which variables we're interested in, which observation period, etc. Some of this can be decided later, but again, at some point, one person or a couple of people are going to be doing most of the work on this, and it needs to be reasonable, right? For say one postdoc to do that analysis at the end. Unless, of course, this is the point of making a lot of the outputs available to the community, because then, if you're particularly interested in one analysis that we haven't included as part of the experiment, those outputs will be there and you can take them to do your own evaluation for a specific product, let's just say, or benchmarking against a specific product. Then finally, just back to the sort of the strategy for validation and evaluation. So as everyone will be doing some kind of site level validation, I mentioned that we'll decide on a sort of cal-val split. And validation of the calibration variables is not required by you to do, but required to have that cal-val split so that that can be analyzed. Whether we decide, again, to sort of mandate more of a global scale output and evaluation is something to discuss, whether we require everyone to do that. And then the more at that global scale, and also at the site-based scale, any kind of what tools we use, what metrics we use for that evaluation and benchmarking. There's a lot of tools out there. Again, we want to make use of what people have done, is to be discussed. Again, this kind of the post-calibration analyses will be more of a focused topic of discussion in the second and maybe third sessions, but you're free, of course, to discuss that today as well. But it's something that we can decide later to some degree. Okay, so I think that's mostly, well, that is it from the plan. I see a lot of comments. I hope I will read that. I hope questions are being answered, maybe from the planning committee or from what we've said. And of course, any further questions we can discuss in our breakout groups. So in these breakout groups, everyone will be assigned randomly. Ignore that Etherpad thing. We tried that last night. Unfortunately, it didn't work. So we will share a Google Doc with you to take notes. We know not everyone can access Google Docs. If you can't, if you can see a request edit, please press that button. An email will go to Hannah. Or if you can't figure it, if that doesn't appear or you can't figure out how to request access, just email Hannah directly. Is that okay, Hannah? to request access. Everyone in every group, we haven't organized this, but it would be great if we could have someone taking the lead to ensure, everyone gets a turn to discuss, someone to take notes in that Google Doc, or if they want to take notes elsewhere, then share that with us. That would be great. And then someone who's willing to report back to the main session at the end. And some prompts here, what are your thoughts on this proposal? And are we overlooking anything that you want to see? Any other thoughts on any of this is great. But again, a reminder that by the end of this whole series of workshops, we need to decide on a protocol. We do have some ideas of, how we'll move those discussions along in the second and third sessions. But yeah, so that's the sort of focus that we're looking for